Chapter 20, The Blackberry Kiss. That night, I tried to write the mini journal for Mr. Berkway. First, I made a list of all the things I liked, and they were things from Bybanks. The trees, the cows, the chickens, the pigs, the fields, the swimming hole. It was a complete jumble of things, and when I tried to write about any of those things, I ended up writing about my mother because everything was connected to her, at least. At last, I wrote about the blackberry kiss. One morning, when I awoke very early, I saw my mother walking up the hill to the barn. Mist hung around the ground. Finches were singing in the oak tree beside the house, and there was my mother, her pregnant belly sticking out in front of her. She was strolling up the hill, swinging her arms and singing, "Oh, don't fall in love with a sailor boy, sailor boy, sailor boy. Don't fall in love with a sailor boy, 'cause he will take your heart to sea." As she approached the corner of the barn where the sugar maple stands, she plucked a few blackberries from a stray bush and she popped them into her mouth. She looked all around her, back at the house, across the field, and into the canopy of branches overhead. She took several quick steps up to the trunk of the maple, threw her arms around it, and she kissed that tree soundly. Later that day, I examined the tree trunk. I tried to wrap my arms about it, but the trunk was too big. It was much bigger than it had seemed from my window. I looked up at where her mouth must have touched the trunk. I probably imagined this, but I thought I could detect a small dark stain from the blackberry kiss. I put my ear against the trunk and listened. I faced that tree squarely, and I kissed it firmly. To this day, I can smell the smell of the bark, a sweet, woody smell, and feel the ridges of the bark, and taste the distinctive taste on my lips. In my mini journal, I confess that since then I kissed all different kinds of trees, and each family of trees, oaks, maples, elms, birches, had a special flavor, all of its own. Mixed in with each tree's own taste was the slight taste of blackberries. And why this was so, I could not explain. The next day, I turned in this story to Mr. Berkway. He didn't even read it or look over at it, but he said, "Marvelous, brilliant!" And he slipped it into his briefcase. "I'll put it in with the other journals." Phoebe said, "Did you write about me?" Ben said, "Hey, did you write about me?" Mr. Berkway bounded around the room as if the opportunity to teach us was his notion of paradise. He read a poem by E. Cummings titled, "The Little Horse is Newly." And the reason why the only capital letter in the title is the Y at the end of newly is because Mr. Cummings, he liked to do it that way. He probably never took English, Phoebe said. To me, that Y looked like a newly born horse standing up on its thin legs. The poem was about a newly born horse who doesn't know anything but feels everything. He lives in a smooth, beautifully folded world. I liked that. I was not sure what it was, but I liked it. Everything sounded soft and safe. That day, Phoebe left school early for a dentist appointment. I started walking home alone, but Ben joined me. I was completely unprepared for what happened on my way home and for what would happen later. Ben and I were simply walking along, and he said, "Did anyone ever read your poem?" "No." "I know how to do it," he said. "You want me to read yours?" And he took my hand and he stared at it for the longest time. His own hand was soft and warm. Mine was sweating like crazy. He was saying, and he was tracing the lines on my palm with his finger. It gave me little shivers, but not in an entirely unpleasant way. The sun was beating down on us, and I thought it might be nice to stay there forever. With him running his finger along my palm like that, and I thought about the newly born horse who knows nothing and feels everything. I thought about the smooth, beautifully folded world. Finally, Ben said, "Do you want to know the good news first or the bad news?" He coughed. The bad news. Is it Is it really bad? Is it? He coughed. The bad news is, I can't really read palms. I snatched my hand away. Don't you want to know the good news? He asked. I started walking. The good news is that you let me hold your hand for almost 5 minutes and you didn't flinch once. I didn't know what to make of him. He walked me all the way to my house, even though I refused to speak to him. He waited on the porch until I was ready to go to Phoebe's, and then he walked me to her house. And when I knocked at Phoebe's door, Ben said, I'll be going now. I took a quick look at him and turned back to the door, but in the instant that I was turning my head, he leaned forward, and I do believe his lips kissed my ear. I was not sure this was what he intended. In fact, I was not sure it happened at all, because before I knew it, he'd hopped down the steps and was walking away. The door inched open, and there was Phoebe's round face, as white and frightened as you could ever imagine. Quick, she said, come in. She let me into the kitchen. On the kitchen table was an apple pie, and beside it were 3 envelopes, one for Phoebe, one for Prudence, and one for her father. I opened my note, Phoebe said, showing it to me. It says, keep all the doors locked and call your father if you need anything. I love you, Phoebe. It was signed Mom. I didn't think too much of it, Phoebe said. I know. It doesn't sound terrible or anything. In fact, my first thought was, well, good. She knows I'm old enough to be here by myself. I figured she was out shopping, or maybe she decided to return to work, even though she wasn't supposed to go back to Rocky's Rubber until next week. But then Prudence came home and opened her note. Phoebe showed me the note left for Prudence. It says, please heat up the spaghetti sauce and boil the spaghetti. I love you, Prudence. It was signed Mom. I still didn't think too much of it, but Phoebe was suspicious. Prudence had made the spaghetti while I helped Phoebe set the table. Phoebe and I even made a salad. I do feel sort of independent, Phoebe said. When Phoebe's father came home, Phoebe showed him the note. He opened it and sat down, staring at the piece of paper. Phoebe looked over his shoulders and read the note aloud. I had to go away. I can't explain. I'll call you in a few days. I had a sinking feeling. Prudence started asking a million questions. What does she mean? Go away where? Why can't she explain? Why didn't she tell you? Did she mention this? A few days? Where will she go? Maybe we should call the police, Phoebe said. I think she was kidnapped or something. Oh, Phoebe, Mr. Winterbottom said. I'm serious. She said, maybe the lunatic came in the house and dragged her off. Phoebe, that's not funny. I'm not being funny. I mean it. It could happen. Prudence was still asking questions. Where did she go? Why didn't she mention this? Didn't she tell you? Where did she go? Prudence! I honestly cannot say, said her father. I think we should call the police, Phoebe repeated. Phoebe, if she was kidnapped, would the lunatic, as you call him, allow her to sit down and write these notes? He stood up, removed his coat, and said, let's eat. As I left, Phoebe said, my mother has disappeared, Sal. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell a soul. At home, my father was slumped over the photo album. He used to close the album quickly when I came in the room, as if he was embarrassed to be caught with it. Lately, however, he didn't bother to close it. It was as if he didn't have the strength to do that. On the open page was a photo of my father and my mother sitting in the grass beneath the sugar maple. His arms were around her, and she was sort of folded in between him. His face was pressed up into hers, and their hair blended together. They almost looked like they were connected. Phoebe's mother went away, I said. He looked up at me. She left some notes. She says she's coming back, but I don't believe it. I went upstairs and tried to work on my mythology report. My father came to my doorway and said, people usually come back. Now I can see that he was just talking in general, just trying to be comforting. But then that night, what I heard and what he said was the tiniest reassurance of something I'd been thinking and hoping. I had been praying that a miracle would happen and my mother would come back and we would return to Bybanks and everything would be exactly the way it used to be. Chapter 21, Souls. At school the next day, Phoebe wore a fixed expression, a sealed, thin smile. It must have been hard for her to maintain that smile because by the time English class came around, her chin was quivering from the strain. She was extremely quiet all day. She didn't speak to anyone but me, and the only thing she said to me was, "Stay at my house tonight." It wasn't a question, it was a command. Mr. Berkway gave us 15-second exercise. As fast as we could, without thinking, we were to draw something. He would tell us what we were to draw when everyone was ready. "Remember," he said, "don't think, just draw. 15 seconds. Ready? Draw your soul. Go." We all wasted 5 seconds staring blankly back at him. When we saw that he was serious and he was watching the clock, our pencils hit the paper. I was thinking there wasn't time to think. When Mr. Berkway called, "Stop!" everyone looked up, dazed. Then we all looked down at our papers, and a buzz went around the room. We were surprised by what had come out of our pencils. Mr. Berkway zipped around the room, scooping up the papers and shuffling them and tacking them up to the bulletin board. He said, "We now have everyone's soul captured." We all crowded around. The first thing I noticed that every single person had drawn a central shape, a heart, a circle, a square, or a triangle. I thought that was unusual. I mean, no one drew a bus or a spaceship or a cow. They all drew these same shapes. Next, I noticed that inside each figure was a distinct design. At first, it seemed that everyone was different. There was a cross, a dark scribble, an eye, a mouth, a window. There was one with a teardrop inside. I thought that must be Phoebe's. Then Mary Lou said, "Look at that. 2 are exactly the same." People were saying, "Geez," and "Wow," and "Whose are those?" The duplicate designs were a circle with a large maple leaf in the center. The tips of the leaf were touching the sides of the circle. One of the maple leaf circles was mine. The other was Ben's.